Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Skype session. I'm here with Andrew Lazo.
Cheers.
Cheers. Now, on the podcast this week, you heard Matt and Brenton talking about the fifth of Uncle Screwtape's letters. We entitled the episode, War, What Is It Good For? And so now Andrew and I are going to chat about that episode and the parts of the letter that we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, they did a really fun job, but I kept wishing that I could have chimed in. That'll be no surprise to our listeners.
Yeah, me too. So let's return to the letter.
Sure.
Screwtape begins by berating Wormwood, and he says, yes, this new European war, warfare and suffering, they're fun, but he makes the point, none of this does them any good unless it results in the capturing of a soul. And he says, we capture souls by undermining faith and preventing the formation of virtues.
I think that's so funny, but it's also one of those places where we can really use our Screwtape tool, where we have to unscrew that, we have to twist it out, and be mindful that in this season, election season, whatever season, what we should do is those things that not undermine, but undergird faith. And we should be on watch for those things that undermine them. And then we should work hard at forming the virtues and be mindful of those things that get in the way of forming those virtues.
And those virtues come from habits, and habits come from repetition. I know this is definitely true in my own life. Marie and I, we started doing a Bible in a year reading plan when we weren't even engaged at that point. We were still boyfriend and girlfriend. But I've got to say, we've now really found our stride now that we're married, because our Bible reading is now part of our routine. When we get up in the morning, Marie's a deeper sleeper, so I'm usually up first. First thing I do, I go and put on the kettle, make a pot of tea, and then I bring the pot together with our Bibles, and we do our Bible reading. And once we finish that, then the day begins, and not before. And it's only because that has become part of our routine. That virtue is being formed, albeit very slowly, but it's being formed because it's part of our own habits, but it's part of our morning routine.
Wow, no, that's a wonderful way to start. Well, and there's this pattern that Lewis gives that I find so incredibly helpful in Mere Christianity, written right around the same time, where he said that if we repeat an action, that action will become a habit. And then if we repeat a habit, that habit will become a virtue. And a virtue, remember, is it's kind of like the smell that we have. It's kind of like the aura that we have. So I want to be a man in communication with God. And I'm not all that great at that. And so I bring lots of reminders. I have lots of prayer books and I pray in the morning. And I also have taken to putting prayer beads on my car, on the mirror. And so when I get in the car, my first thing is to grab the prayer beads. And now it's become kind of a habit to pick them up, and when I'm driving to church or whatever, to pull those beads out and use those as a prompt to prayer. The action of putting the beads there and of starting to pray becomes the habit, and what I hope happens is that becomes eventually a virtue. And it sounds like that's what you and Marie are doing with your mornings.
And we've already said that once we've finished reading the Bible, we're going to try and keep this pattern that whatever we're reading together, we read first thing in the morning.
That's good. I think that it's helpful to know that vice is created in exactly the same way. So just like you now have a pattern in the morning of starting in the scriptures, Friday is my day off of school, and it's really easy for me to be slothful after a long week. And what I find is if I give myself the day off on Friday, it becomes much harder the next Friday to really buckle down and work. And so the development of vice by an action repeated into a habit, that's kind of how that happens. And I think that's why Lewis says in Mere Christianity, talks about the gain of just one hill in a war. And so Screwtape wants us to forget those actions that will turn into habits. Or he wants us to practice those things that will turn into vices. And I think it's good for us to have our eyes open to that.
The process of being transformed into a heavenly or hellish creature is through those little steps, just done many, many times. Now, the next thing in the letter, Screwtape asks his nephew for more information about the patient, because he says that they want to decide whether to turn him into a patriot or a pacifist. And Screwtape is going to come back to this in an episode that you and I are going to record. assuming that Screwtape doesn't get involved with all of our technology again, because, listeners, we've been battling him today.
Yes. So we decided to come here now. And, I think that those extremities are what he wants, except our extreme devotion to the enemy, is what the letter says. The same thing can be drawn in our political system right now. Being extreme about your political belief is not nearly so important as being extreme about our devotion to the Lord and the development of those character virtues in our lives. It's a tough way to go, though.
Now, for me, the main bulk of this letter is about Screwtape disabusing Wormwood of warfare. Because on a first instinct, when you wonder, how would the demons think of warfare? Well, they've got to love it, surely. And Screwtape admits, yes, it does cause a lot of cruelty and unchastity, and we like those things. But he then lists out a series of downsides from warfare. He says, during wars, people turn to God. They're distracted from themselves because there is now a cause greater than themselves. And this was true for Lewis. He actually wrote in a letter to his friend Arthur Greaves in 1939, he says that this war has come in the nick of time. He says, I was too well settled, I was too successful, too complacent. And having lived and fought through a war earlier in his life, he knows that this is going to cure him of that.
Yeah. Well, and I think that war is really important because, as Lewis points out in this book, the devil will sometimes grant us one sin or success over one sin so that another sin can take over. Oh, yes, let's let your patient become very chaste, and then let's make him incredibly proud of his chastity. We'll take chastity as long as we get pride for it. And so what the enemy wants us to do is turn anything that happens to us, especially those untoward things, and grumble and complain. But God, if he can use the death of his son on the cross, if he can use Balaam's ass, he can use anything in between. And so to the pure, all things are pure. Brenton and Matt were talking about Elie Wiesel and his experience in the camps in World War I, in the concentration camps. Wiesel effectively lost his faith in the camps, but Corrie ten Boom, about whom my wife has spoken many times, found her faith in the concentration camp. So the issue isn't the concentration camp. The issue is the attitude of our hearts.
It's that quotation we've mentioned quite a few times already this season, that it's from The Magician's Nephew. How you receive something depends very much on the kind of person you are and from where you're standing.
Yes, absolutely.
But on that point where you said that God can use terrible things even for great things, the prime example being Jesus and the cross, it's kind of funny in the letter because Screwtape finds this really unfair. He says God will even use bad causes, and he just doesn't think that's right. And that puts me in mind of the last battle with Emeth. And I'm not going to say any more about that because Matt hasn't read the book yet, so we're not going to spoil it for him. But just listing that as an example of where Aslan, in this case, brings good out of something that was originally twisted.
Well, and I always love how Screwtape is outraged that things aren't fair. What does he care about fairness? He's playing with house money. If something wasn't fair, he should be delighting in that. But that's how twisted that kind of thinking gets until we examine it ourselves.
Well, he's like us when we see grace being given to somebody else. When we are the laborer in the vineyard who went in the first shift, and now these Johnny-come-latelys are getting paid the same as we are. Doesn't seem fair. Now, one other downside of warfare that Screwtape emphasizes is that during wars, people know that they're going to die. The medieval Christians had a Latin phrase called memento mori, remember death. And imminent death makes us attend to the more important things in life. I actually have a friend, Rochelle. She's got this golden skull that she keeps on her desk, just to remind her with that memento mori idea. I told her that she needed to naturally name him Mori.
That's fantastic. I think that our culture wants to hide death. We want to prolong death. Certainly in the part of the country where you live, there's plenty of plastic surgeons going on to try and tap into the eternal fountain of youth. But but death, according to St. Francis, Francis called it brother death. And Lewis, as he was getting older and exchanging the letters to an American lady, Lewis joked about the train soon leaving the station, and aren't we going to be glad to be done with that? And elsewhere, he talks about death is almost kind of a joke. He calls it rather solemn fun to think about death. And he died a relatively young man. I mean, he died a week shy of his 65th birthday. But death, I don't think, in terms of the Christian outlook, is something to be feared. And certainly God transformed everything by the death of his son.
And in Learning in Wartime, Lewis underscores this. He says, war makes death real to us. And that would have been regarded as one of the blessings by most great Christians in the past. They thought it was good for us to always be aware of our mortality. I'm inclined to think they were right.
Well, and it's certainly something that is going to happen to us and is going to open the door into our eternal life. And so I think as a Christian, it's not necessarily something to be shied away from. I'm not looking forward to it. I still have a lot of life to live, please God. But I think that this, too, is a gift from God, even though his gift sometimes seems so strangely wrapped.
The letter starts to wrap up, and we find out that there is disagreement in hell. Who would have thought it? But Screwtape says that some demons think that wars are great opportunities for attacking faith. But he thinks that all of this is overblown, the idea of using suffering, because he says the enemy's human partisans, and by that he means the prophets of the Old Testament, the saints of the New Testament, and the saints alive today. He said they've made it very clear that suffering is an essential part of redemption.
Yeah, this is what he says in chapter 6 of Problem of Pain. In the first and lowest operation of pain, it shatters the illusion that all is well. The second shatters the illusion that what we have, whether good or bad in itself, is our own and enough for us. Everyone has noticed how hard it is to turn our thoughts to God when everything is going well with us.
And there's so much in the New Testament about this. As we've been battling, trying to get a different episode recorded and failing at every turn, it's put me in mind of the Epistle to the Philippians, where Paul says, "Count it as pure joy, my brethren, when trials of many kinds come upon you." And that's not the only place. Throughout all of the epistles and throughout the Gospels, Jesus says, "In this world you will have trouble." Mm-hmm. It's not an if, it's a when. That suffering and these difficulties, they will be coming at you regardless. You're not going to get out of life alive. Don't think you're going to get away from suffering. It's going to come one way or the other. The only thing that is going to be different is how you receive it.
And we are to take heart, which is the same advice that Aslan gives to Lucy, to have courage, dear heart. We're to take heart because he has gone that way of suffering before us and knows and has been on the other side, and he has overcome the world. And so I think that he gives us great hope in facing what everybody is going to face. But from the light of eternity, I think that things happen much more differently. Francis Collins, who we've mentioned here before, a part of his conversion happened when he was speaking to terminally ill cancer patients. And so many of them would be at peace because of their Christian faith. And he asked one of them, an old woman, why are you so content? Why do you have such joy? And she said, well, it's because of what I believe, Dr. Collins. What do you believe? And that was the question that kind of turned him onto the path that led him through mere Christianity and a number of other things to faith. And we're going to, suffer these things in the world, but our citizenship is not of this world, and it's not of this election, and it's not of this country, and it's not of the difficulty that we're going through today. And certainly he has walked that way before us, and we can, even in our own suffering, help to fill up the sufferings of Christ. St. Paul says that he is graciously granted not only that we believe, but also that we suffer. And so gracious means a gift, and he's given us suffering as a gift. But taken the right way and turned towards God, those sufferings, even the deep ones, can indeed be a gift, because God is not shy about stooping down to help us and to raise us. And of course, he has walked that road before we have.
And in particular, along Calvary, which is the reminder that even the worst of things can be transformed into the best of things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, you know that there's a manuscript variant for this letter. So I want to talk about this because I've seen the variants and I've read them. I think this one is my favorite.
Yes.
I wish Lewis had included this.
This is something that Lewis crossed out. I got to spend some time in 2015 in New York City and was a research fellow at the New York Public Library. And on the third floor at the Berg Collection, they actually have the manuscript of Screwtape. I think I mentioned in an earlier podcast that he left it with Sister Penelope, and then when she asked if he wanted it back, he said, well, just sell it to some rich fool. And that rich fool was the New York Public Library. So you can go to the third floor to the archive, and they'll bring out the actual manuscript in Lewis's own handwriting, his tea stains, and right there it is. We'll talk about another manuscript variant next time, but this is what he says in letter 5. He omits it. He crosses it out. But he wrote this. But though the fruit is not going to drop into our mouths, there is fruit to be had. Excitement is, on the whole, in our favor. A man hanging on each bulletin can be made to forget that the enemy has taught him. Exaggeration helps excitement. Encourage your patient to think and feel as if there had never been a war till now, and as if there were no tribulations in peace. Isn't that marvelous?
So good. And again, I have to remind myself about this constantly when I'm reading Lewis. He didn't write it yesterday. But how applicable is that to 2020?
It was fun when I did the talkbacks for Screwtape Letters. I guess it was in 2017 in the spring in Houston. And Screwtape seems so, the Screwtape on Stage that Max McLean and Fellowship for Performing Arts starring Brent Harris. Marvelous, marvelous show. But it seems so fresh, and people often in the crowd would say, why does this, how did Lewis know what we were going through? And in Max's transcript, he only changes one word. He changes air raids to terrorism, and everything else is straight from Screwtape. Yet it still appeals to people today. I think that Lewis really looked deeply inside himself, and he looked into the light of God and into the Word of God, and I think that that's part of what makes these things so helpful. This thing that he wrote in 1941 echoes Learning in Wartime, where he talks about excitement as the great enemy, and says, it's only excitement can be the enemy of hunkering down to work. Learning in Wartime is a sermon he gave to Oxford students in 1939 as the war was breaking out. And the prevailing question was, why should we care about humane literature when the war is starting to happen? And he said, and I'm going to quote this wrong, he says, it's only those people who care so much about their work that they get down to it at inopportune moments. Opportune moments never come, right? And so this idea that excitement can draw us away, I'm tempted to follow every single update on election night and check the Electoral College, but that may not really help me in terms of the preparation that I'm doing here in seminary. And so excitement can tend to pull us from the task at hand and pull us from the enemy, even just a little bit. And that's what would satisfy Screwtape.
And flooding our mind with something other than God. Paul writes in Romans 12, he talks about transform your mind, renew your mind. And here, Screwtape says, keep that man hanging on each bulletin.
Yes.
Let that be filling his mind. Whether it's CNN, MSNBC, whichever your poison is, have him focused on that. Let him fill his mind with that and not with, say, the Word of God. So that when difficulty comes, when his candidate doesn't get elected, that he can remember that this is an opportunity to offer something up, to know that whoever is president, there's one person who's king.
Yes. I was at Church of the Redeemer in Sarasota, Florida, preaching recently, and Father Wilson said, tune out and tune in, right? Or turn off and tune in. Turn off whatever the Twitter feed is in your head that makes you think of things from anything but from an earthly perspective or from a hellish perspective. Tune into the work of God, and that work of God goes on. And that work of God will continue to go on. And there's great joy, I think, to be had in seeing how Christ's Spirit will not be bounded by our own events. And I think Screwtape wants to keep the noise level loud. We'll talk in a few weeks about music and silence, how I detest them both. And I think that he wants to keep the chatter going.
I think that's a perfect place to end. So, listeners, please join us again on the next podcast episode and in the next Skype session. Cheers.
Cheers.